My daughter-in-law took over my spare room while I was gone, and I lost the right to sleep in my own house the way I used to. It happened quietly, and by the time I noticed, it already felt permanent. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. When I left for my surgery, I didn't think about the spare room at all. It was just there. It had been there for years, holding things that didn't have a place yet. A dresser I brought from my old house. A small table I used when my hands were steadier. A lamp that made the room warm in the evenings. I packed lightly, 2 bags. Loose clothes, nothing from that room because I expected to come back to it. My son drove me to my brother's house. We talked about the weather, the timing of the surgery, how long I'd probably be away. A few weeks, maybe a little more. I didn't lock anything, I didn't label anything. I didn't think it was necessary. While I was recovering, I didn't call much. I slept. I waited. I healed slowly the way you do at that age. When I finally came back, the house looked the same from the outside. Same door, same mat, same plants by the steps. Inside, nothing was obviously wrong either. That was the strange part. My daughter-in-law greeted me politely. My son carried my bags. They asked how I was feeling. Then she said she had a call and went upstairs. She said, "I need to get back to the office." I didn't think about the word then. I followed my son to where I would be sleeping. The spare room door was closed. He opened the door to the den where a folding bed was already set up, neatly centered with a small table beside it. He said, "This will work better for now." I nodded. The first thing I noticed was the light. It came from one window instead of 2. The second thing was the bed. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. I didn't ask where my furniture was. I didn't ask what "for now" meant. I told myself I was tired, that I'd ask later. That evening, I heard her upstairs again, laughing softly into her headset. I heard the word "office" a second time. When I went to get a glass of water, I saw a donation receipt on the counter. Folded, not hidden, it listed my dresser. My table, the lamp. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Then I folded it again and put it back where it was. No one mentioned it. That night, I unfolded the bed slowly, careful not to make noise. I slept there. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself everything would feel clearer in the morning. It didn't. The next day passed like that one, and the one after, nothing happened, and somehow that was the hardest part. I kept waiting for something to be said. Nothing was. I stayed where the bed was. I didn't move anything. I didn't understand it yet. Before the surgery, the spare room still felt like part of the house that belonged to me, not in a proud way. Not in a claimed way, it was just there. The bed stayed made most of the time. The lamp stayed plugged in even during the day. The dresser was half full, not organized carefully, just enough to know what was inside. I didn't decorate it. I didn't lock the door. I didn't think of it as something that needed protecting. I used the room when I needed quiet. That was all. I folded laundry there when the television was on downstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed to put on my shoes when my knees didn't want to bend. Sometimes I laid paperwork across the dresser because the afternoon light came in clean through that window. I didn't call it my room. I thought of it as part of the house and, by extension, part of where I fit. Back then, my daughter-in-law worked at the kitchen table. Her papers spread out in the mornings and were stacked neatly again before dinner. Her laptop was moved aside so we could eat. When calls ran long, she apologized. I said it was fine, and it was. The house adjusted itself without effort, the way it had for years. I didn't notice when that started to shift. It didn't announce itself. One day she mentioned needing more quiet. Another day she said her company was encouraging remote work full-time. I listened. I nodded. I didn't connect those words to the spare room. Not then. It didn't occur to me that a space I wasn't actively using could already be spoken for. Before the surgery, I moved through the house without thinking about where I was allowed to be. I made tea in the afternoons and sat wherever the light felt best. I left books on the side table and came back to them later. I didn't gather my things into one place. I didn't feel the need to. When my brother offered to have me stay with him after the surgery, it seemed practical. His house was quieter. No stairs. My son agreed right away. My daughter-in-law said it would be easier for everyone. I packed a small bag. I thought I'd be gone a short while. I left most of my things where they were. Before I left, I stood in the spare room and checked the window. I straightened the bedspread not because it needed it, but because that's what I always did before going away. I didn't take the lamp, I didn't clear the dresser, I didn't think anyone else would need the space. At my brother's house, everything was decided ahead of time. He asked what time I liked breakfast. He cleared a shelf in the bathroom. He asked if the mattress felt right. I said it was fine. I didn't think much about home then. Recovery narrows your attention. Occasionally, my daughter-in-law texted, "Hope you're resting. Let us know if you need anything." Polite, brief. Nothing suggested changes were happening. Nothing asked permission. When I came back, the differences felt sudden only because I hadn't been watching them happen. Looking back, I can see how the house must have been reorganized while I was gone. How decisions would have felt efficient, obvious. At the time, I only knew that something familiar had been replaced by something finished. Before all this, the spare room was rarely discussed. It didn't need to be. It existed the same way my chair did. My place at the table, not a privilege, just settled. I assumed space remained unless someone said otherwise. I assumed changes came with conversations attached. I assumed that if something was no longer mine, I would be told. Those assumptions belonged to the time before, when my presence didn't need managing, when my absence, even a temporary one, didn't invite permanent solutions. I didn't know yet that what I remembered as ordinary would soon feel like evidence of something already slipping away. After I came back, the changes didn't arrive all at once. They repeated. Quietly, each one felt small enough to ignore on its own. Together, they began to shape my days. The office door upstairs started closing earlier. At first, it was after breakfast, then before. I learned the sound of it, the soft click followed by the low hum of the computer. I timed my coffee around that sound. If I was already in the kitchen when it happened, I stayed there longer than I needed to. If I wasn't, I waited. The folding bed stopped feeling temporary. I noticed how it was always put back the same way, lined up with the wall, blanket smoothed flat, no rush, no hesitation. It had a place now. That told me more than any conversation could have. My things began to feel scattered, even though I was the one keeping them contained. A book I left on the arm of the couch would be moved to the side table by evening. My shoes were lined up neatly by the door, toes pointing in as if they belonged to a guest. I started putting them away myself before anyone else could. Once, I opened the hall closet to get a jacket and saw my coats shifted to one side. The space had been divided down the middle, no comment, no explanation. I stood there longer than I needed to, counting hangers, then closed the door carefully. The kitchen followed the same pattern. Things I used often were pushed back to make room for new ones. My mug was moved to a lower shelf. I reached for it one morning and stopped, surprised by the gap where it used to be. I didn't say anything. I took a different mug and washed it by hand, even though the dishwasher was empty. Conversations changed too. When my son talked about schedules, he spoke to his wife first, then filled me in later if it affected me. He didn't mean anything by it. I told myself that. I nodded. I adjusted. The office became a fixed point in the house. Packages arrived with company names on them. A printer appeared in the living room for a while, then disappeared upstairs. I heard meetings through the ceiling, voices I didn't know, timelines, deadlines. The house felt busier, just not with me. I started spending more time in my corner. It was easier than navigating the rest of the space. I kept my bag there. My glasses, my mail, I stopped leaving things out. I stopped expecting them to stay where I put them. One afternoon, I noticed a small sign taped to the office door. On call. The handwriting wasn't mine. I read it twice. Then I went downstairs and sat quietly until the door opened again. No one mentioned the sign. Later, it was gone. Meals adjusted themselves without discussion. Dinner was pushed later on days with long meetings. If I ate earlier, no one commented. If I waited, sometimes I waited alone. Plates were cleared efficiently. The kitchen reset itself quickly, ready for the next day. Each repetition confirmed something I still didn't name. I felt it in how I paused before entering rooms, how I listened for cues that had nothing to do with me. I learned where I could be without interrupting. I learned when it was better to stay still. Nothing dramatic happened. No one told me to move. No one raised their voice. The house simply kept arranging itself, and I kept fitting into the spaces that were left. At the time, I told myself this was normal. Houses change, families adjust. Work takes priority. Those explanations worked for a while. What I didn't notice then was how often the same pattern repeated. decisions made, spaces assigned, and my understanding arriving only after everything was already in place. As the days settled into that shape, I began noticing myself more than anything else. Not in a thoughtful way, not with conclusions, just interruptions. I would start to do something, then stop. I would think about saying something, then decide it wasn't necessary. I kept waiting for a natural moment to ask about the room. I waited the way people wait to cross a street, watching for a break that never quite comes. Each day, I told myself it would feel clearer tomorrow. Each day ended without that clarity. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. That word kept coming back to me, even though no one had said it. I had a roof, food, company. My son still asked how I was feeling. My daughter-in-law still included me in small decisions. What to order for groceries, soup or salad. Nothing obvious had been taken away except something I couldn't quite point to. I started rehearsing sentences in my head and discarding them before they were finished. I noticed the room felt too direct. I was wondering about the furniture, sounded petty. I didn't realize, made it sound like a misunderstanding I should have caught earlier. Each version ended the same way, with me feeling foolish for not speaking sooner, as if timing itself had already decided the outcome. There were moments when I almost convinced myself I preferred it this way. Less responsibility, less space to manage. I told myself the folding bed was practical. I told myself I didn't need much anymore. Those thoughts came easily, which made me trust them less. At night, I stayed awake longer than before, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was alert. I listened for movement upstairs, the roll of a chair, a door opening, a door closing. I tried to place myself in relation to those sounds, as if mapping where I fit now required attention. Once, my son asked if the bed was okay. He asked it casually, passing through the room on his way somewhere else. I said it was fine. He nodded and kept moving. I watched his back as he left, noticing how easily the question had been checked off. I thought about calling after him. I didn't. The moment passed, and with it, whatever chance I thought it carried. I began to notice how careful I was becoming. I wiped counters that weren't dirty. I folded blankets more neatly than necessary. I kept my voice low even when the house was empty. These were habits I recognized from other times in my life, times when I had learned to take up less space without being asked. I didn't like that recognition, but I didn't push it away either. I let it sit there unresolved. Sometimes I told myself speaking up would only complicate things, that it would create tension where none existed. Other times, I wondered if the tension was already there, just settled into the walls. Quiet. Accepted by everyone except me. I noticed that no one asked how long I planned to stay. The question never came, and I didn't offer an answer. The absence of that conversation felt intentional, though I couldn't have said why. What stayed with me most was the sense that whatever I was trying to understand had already been decided without my input. I was arriving late to something that had already moved on. And the longer I waited, the harder it felt to ask for a place that might no longer be available. I told myself I would wait a little longer. I always told myself that. It didn't arrive all at once. There wasn't a moment where I sat down and understood everything. It came in pieces. The way you notice something has shifted only after you've been adjusting to it for a while. One afternoon, I stood at the bottom of the stairs holding a stack of mail. I was deciding whether to take it up to my corner or leave it on the table. I waited. The office door was closed. I could hear my daughter-in-law speaking upstairs, steady, clear. I stayed where I was until the call ended. I didn't think about why I waited. I just did. When I finally moved, I noticed how practiced the pause had become. I didn't feel unsure. I felt trained. That was when it settled in. I hadn't been waiting for permission. I had been working around something that no longer included me. I thought back to the first day I came home, to how the desk had already been set up, the cords tucked away, the plant placed just right. That hadn't been temporary. Temporary things are unfinished. They shift. They get discussed. What I walked into had been completed. I remembered the donation receipt, how it had been folded and left out in the open. No one hid it. No one explained it either. It wasn't meant for me to react to. It was just part of the process, like moving a chair or replacing a bulb. I had assumed that if something important was happening, I would be included by default. That assumption stayed with me longer than it should have. Looking back, I could see how often decisions had been made efficiently, without stopping. without checking whether I needed to be part of them. The realization wasn't that my daughter-in-law wanted an office. That made sense. It wasn't even that my furniture was gone. Furniture can be replaced. What settled in was the understanding that the room hadn't been repurposed. It had been reassigned. It wasn't open anymore. It had a function now, and that function didn't bend. I noticed how often I referred to it as her office in my own thoughts. Even though it had been my spare room for years, I hadn't corrected that language inside myself. I had accepted it quickly without noticing how fast that acceptance came. Once I saw that other moments lined up quietly behind it. The way my shoes were placed by the door, the way my mug had been moved, the way conversations happened slightly to the side of me, then reached me later as information, not discussion. None of those moments were new. I had lived through all of them. What changed was how they fit together. I thought about the folding bed, how it was never treated as something to improve or replace. It wasn't discussed as a short-term inconvenience. It had been measured, aligned. It was a solution, not a stopgap. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. I realized then that I had been waiting for someone to acknowledge a disruption that no one else experienced as a disruption. From their perspective, things were working. The house was functioning. Work was getting done, space was being used efficiently. I was the only one adjusting, and I was doing it quietly enough that it didn't register as a problem. What struck me wasn't anger. It was the calm understanding that nothing here was unfinished, nothing unresolved. There was no missing step. The process had already concluded, and I was living inside the result of it. I thought about how carefully I had packed before the surgery. How little I had taken with me. I had assumed continuity. I had assumed my absence would be treated as temporary because it was temporary to me. I could see now that absence, even brief, creates opportunity, not deliberately. Practically, I replayed the moment when my daughter-in-law first said the office out loud. I had been standing in the hallway, listening without really listening. At the time, I thought the word would float past and disappear. It didn't. It stayed because it named something that had already been decided. Once I allowed myself to see that, I stopped waiting for the conversation I thought was coming. There was nothing left to clarify. The clarity was already there. Quiet. The unspoken question I had been circling didn't need to be asked anymore. It had already been answered. Through action, repetition, and the absence of pause. I understood then that my place in the house hadn't been argued away. It hadn't been taken from me, it had been worked around. That understanding didn't change anything about the house. The office door still closed in the morning. The folding bed still stayed where it was. Meals followed the same schedule. Nothing external shifted. What changed was that I stopped expecting a correction. I stopped telling myself this was temporary. I stopped framing my presence as something that would naturally expand again if I waited long enough. I hadn't been overlooked. I had been accounted for quietly as someone who could adjust. Once I saw that, it was impossible to unsee it. After that understanding settled, I didn't say anything about it. Not because I was unsure anymore, but because there was nothing left to ask. The decision had already been made, and reopening it with words would have meant pretending otherwise. What changed was small, mostly invisible. I began acting as if the arrangement was permanent because it was. I stopped thinking in terms of for now. I stopped waiting for cues that were never going to come. I moved my things fully into the corner instead of leaving them loosely arranged. I bought a small plastic drawer unit, measured the space myself, chose one that fit without blocking anything. I didn't ask where to put it. When it arrived, I assembled it quietly in the afternoon while the office door was closed upstairs. No one commented on it. That confirmed what I already knew. I started keeping my mail in a single folder instead of spreading it out on the table. I changed where I charged my phone so the cord wouldn't cross a walkway. I folded the bed earlier in the morning and left it folded longer during the day, even when I could have used it. I didn't want it to feel present. I began eating at the same times every day, earlier than the others. That way, there was nothing to coordinate. I washed my dishes right away, put them back in the lower cabinet without pausing. I stopped leaving my mug out to dry. I dried it myself and placed it carefully on the shelf where it had been moved. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't explain my reasons. From the outside, it probably looked like cooperation, like adjustment, like gratitude. Once my daughter-in-law asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no, even though I did. I didn't want to add another item that needed to be placed somewhere. I didn't want to take up room. I noticed how easily these decisions came once I stopped expecting space to be offered. Choosing not to ask became a form of order. It kept things running smoothly. It avoided the pauses I had learned to recognize as inconvenient. I also stopped making suggestions. When conversations about the house came up, I listened without adding anything. I nodded when plans were mentioned. If my son looked at me briefly, I nodded again. So there would be no need to follow up. The house responded by staying the same. There was a relief in that, one I didn't talk about. Predictability replaced waiting. I knew which spaces were mine and which were not. I knew how long I could stay in a room before it felt like too much. I knew when to move without being asked. Nothing improved, but nothing escalated either. I understood then that my silence wasn't being taken as agreement or disagreement. It was simply being absorbed into the existing structure. The structure didn't need my input. It only needed that I not interrupt it. So I didn't. The decision I made wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. I would live within the arrangement as it existed, not as I once understood it. I would not wait for acknowledgement that was never going to arrive. The folding bed stayed folded most days after that. The office door continued to close each morning, and I adjusted myself to those facts carefully, not because anyone asked me to, but because I had learned where the edges were. That was the choice I made, quietly, without expecting anyone to notice. The consequences didn't show up all at once. They settled in gradually, the way habits do when no one interrupts them. I began to feel how little of myself the house required anymore. Days passed without anyone needing me for anything specific. If I wasn't there at dinner, it was assumed I had eaten. If I stayed in my corner longer than usual, no one checked in, not out of unkindness, out of efficiency. The office upstairs dictated the rhythm of the house. Phone calls started early, sometimes before I was fully awake. I learned to move quietly in the mornings, to prepare breakfast without turning on lights. I didn't want to be heard over someone else's workday. When meetings ran late, dinner adjusted around them. I adjusted too. I ate earlier or later depending on the sound of voices overhead. The folding bed began to affect how I slept. Not physically, structurally, I stopped stretching out. I slept closer to the edge so it would be easier to fold away in the morning. I kept my blanket tight, my pillow centered. Even at night, I stayed contained. I noticed I no longer left the house without checking the schedule first. Not because I was needed, but because I didn't want to return at the wrong moment. There were times I waited in the car until the office door opened again. I told myself it was considerate. I noticed my son spoke less directly to me, not less kindly, just less often. Updates were given instead of conversations. Decisions arrived finished. He would say, "We're doing this," and I would nod because there was nothing left to add. Once I thought about inviting a friend over. I imagined explaining where she would sit, where I would sleep afterward, how the house worked now. I didn't make the call. It felt easier to keep the arrangement invisible than to translate it. I realized then how small my footprint had become, not because I had left, but because I had been reduced to what didn't interfere. I kept myself useful in quiet ways. I folded laundry, watered plants, tidied rooms that weren't mine. I made myself helpful without being noticeable. No one objected to that. No one commented on it either. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and didn't recognize how carefully I was standing. Shoulders angled, arms close, as if space itself required permission. I stopped bringing up the past. I didn't talk about how the house used to feel, where I used to sit, what I used to assume. Those memories felt out of place now, like furniture that no longer fit. What surprised me was how normal this all began to feel. The routine took over, the waiting, the adjusting, the silence. There were days when nothing happened at all, no tension, no awkwardness, just the steady operation of a household that no longer centered me. And on those days, I felt the loss most clearly, not because something went wrong, but because nothing did. Everything worked. Except there was less room for me to exist without thinking about it. I carried that awareness quietly. It didn't demand action. It didn't ask for resolution. It simply stayed with me, present, unacknowledged, like the folding bed, always ready to be put away. After a while, there was nothing left to adjust. The house stayed the same. The schedule stayed the same. The office door continued to close each morning and open again at the end of the day. I learned not to mark time by it. I stopped listening for the sound. The folding bed became routine. I unfolded it at night without thinking about how it used to feel to sleep behind a closed door of my own. In the mornings, I folded it back before anyone else was awake, not because it was required, because it was expected even if no one said so. I noticed that I no longer talked about the spare room, not even in my own thoughts. I didn't refer to it as something I had lost. I referred to it the way you refer to a street you no longer walk down. It existed, just not for me. Sometimes when I passed the bottom of the stairs, I looked up automatically, then looked away again. There was nothing to see. The door was closed or open. Either way, it wasn't mine. My son continued his life as usual. He went to work. He came home. He asked if I needed anything in the same careful tone he had learned. I answered the same way every time. No, my daughter-in-law stayed busy. Her calls sounded confident. Her days sounded full. She rarely needed to come downstairs during work hours. That felt intentional. I stayed out of the way. There were no arguments, no scenes. No moment where someone said I should make other arrangements. That was the part that stayed with me. Nothing ended. It simply continued without me being central to it. I began to understand that this was how things would be remembered. Not as a change, not as a conflict, just as a practical solution that worked. If someone asked later, it would sound reasonable. She needed an office. I was fine where I was. No one would be lying. That was what made it so complete. One afternoon, I sat alone in the den with the bed folded and the room empty. The house was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just quiet. I realized then that this was the version of the house that would continue. Not because anyone chose it again, but because no one needed to revisit it. I had been present for the transition, and then I had been folded into the background of it. I didn't feel the need to mark the moment. There was no date to remember. No sentence that summarized it. Just the steady knowledge that my place in the house had been redefined without requiring my agreement. I sat there for a long time, not waiting, just sitting. When I stood up, I folded the blanket once more, even though it was already neat. I turned off the light and left the room exactly as it was meant to be left.